This lecture is about reproduction. Now, it's not reproduction in humans, it's reproduction in everything else. Well, not everything. Okay, so first off, for the purposes of this discussion, we are defining male and female based on the type of gamete they produce. Gametes are the reproductive cells, the sperm and the egg. Sperm is generally a lot smaller than egg, and males produce a lot more sperm compared to how many eggs a female produces, as a nice general rule. So males produce sperm and females produce eggs. Now, there are plants and quite a few invertebrates that are true hermaphrodites. They are capable of producing both sperm and eggs at the same time. That's what we mean when we say true hermaphrodites. This is significantly less common in vertebrate animals. Vertebrates referring to an animal with an internal skeleton, the fishes, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals. So when we talk about reproduction, we can start by talking about what's probably the earliest evolving form of reproduction, which is asexual. Remember, when you see a scientific or medical term that starts with an A, that A often means without or no. So asexual means without sex. Prokaryotic organisms, like bacteria and archaea, remember, prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. These reproduce primarily through a process called binary fission. Literally, the bacteria grows really big and then divides in two. But they can exchange some genetic material through a process that's called conjugation. And two bacteria will come together. A little bridge will form between the two of them, and they can exchange some DNA through that bridge. A bridge is a hollow tube. Now, bacteria, they get freaky. They do not care if the other bacteria is the same species or not. Yes, I'm serious. This would be like you exchanging some genetic material with your cat. Please don't do that, by the way. So this is a major problem because this is how things like antibiotic resistance spreads. You do see some asexual reproduction in eukaryotes. Things like sponges and plants can bud off part of their body. So you take a portion of the body of a sponge or a plant, and you can often get a new organism growing from that. We see this in, like I said, plants and a few other eukaryotes. Pretty much we're talking about, you can see it in fungi, you can see it in some invertebrates. The starfish, for example, if you cut a starfish, each part can grow into a new individual as long as they have part of that central disc. Now, obviously, that doesn't work with the vertebrate animals. You can't cut off your pinky and grow another you. When we talk about eukaryotes, especially the vertebrate animals, we need to talk about sexual reproduction. This is where a sperm and an egg come together and fuse to form a new individual. The sperm and the egg both have half the number of chromosomes as an adult of that species. So, we're going to start our discussion of reproduction in vertebrates by talking about the sex determination system. This determines whether an individual is male or female. And again, we are using biological definition about gamete production. In humans, sex determination is primarily genetic. We get 2 copies of an X chromosome, we're female, an X and a Y, we're male. Of course, this doesn't always work, but more than 90% of the time, this is how it lines up in humans. In birds and some reptiles, it's also genetic, but it's flipped. So having 2 copies of the same sex chromosome in birds and in some of these reptiles gives you a male. And we call the sex chromosomes in this system Z and W, so we don't get confused with X and Y. So ZZ is male and ZW is female. That's the most familiar and probably the simplest method of sex determination. Haplodiploidy. In certain insects, especially ants and bees, individuals that are haploid, that have 1 copy of each chromosome, are males. And the females are diploid with 2 copies of each chromosome. So what this means is that a reproductive female, bees or ants, if she has not been fertilized, if she doesn't have any sperm, she will produce haploid offspring, which are going to be male. If she's been fertilized, she can fertilize her eggs. She can store sperm for a long period, in some cases, probably most of her life. She gets fertilized, she takes some of that sperm, and she produces daughters. And those are the workers in bees and ants. In turtles, some lizards, and the crocodilians including crocodiles, caimans, gharials, and alligators, temperature determines the sex of the offspring. And each group has their own temperature range. A certain temperature range, you get a male, a different temperature range, you get a female. So these 3 graphs are looking at 3 different species. And we see that in turtles, cooler temperatures favor males and warmer temperatures favor females. In the lizard species on this graph, it's the opposite. And with the crocodilians, very warm or very cool favors females, and somewhere in the middle favors males. This has a lot of implications for what's going to happen with these species with climate change. And then there's this. Some fish and some amphibians can change sex. So we call this sequential hermaphroditism. So at any given time, they're either male or female, but during their entire lifespan, they can switch between those. So they're not male and female at the same time. Clownfish are the best example. They are all born male. The largest clownfish in a given area is going to be the female. and the rest will be males. If the current female, if something happens to her, if she gets eaten, if she swims off and gets lost, then the largest male in that area will switch sexes and become the female, which totally ruins the plot of Finding Nemo. Sorry, guys. Okay, so that's sex determination systems. Now let's talk about some unusual forms of reproduction. And I'm going to start with parthenogenesis. So when we think back to the bees and the ants and the unfertilized egg becoming a male offspring, that is a form of parthenogenesis. An unfertilized egg develops into an adult. Now, this can also happen not just in insects, but it can occur in some fish, some amphibians, some reptiles, some birds. Wow, crazy when you think about it, right? So in chickens and turkeys, about 1 out of 1,000 unfertilized eggs will go on to develop into a male adult. You want to think back to the sex determination system to think why that might be. Now, this does not always produce a viable offspring in birds, but it can. This is an advantage that allows females to reproduce in the absence of males. So if the population is widely dispersed or the female has moved into a new habitat, a new area where there aren't any other of her species. Think about lizards. Lizards can ride vegetation, fallen trees and that sort of stuff across the ocean and end up on a new island. And if there's no competition, her offspring can then evolve and spread out and be the lizards of the island. The offspring are going to be more genetically similar to the female parent when there's only a female parent compared to when there's a male and a female parent. So why are we looking at these lizards? These are whip-tailed lizards. And in this species of lizards, we have the ZW sex determination system. 2 Z chromosomes are a male, and a ZW gives you a female. The lizards in the middle are Nimidophorus hybrids. Whew! C. neomexicanus, the Mexican whip-tailed. These are all female. All members of this species are female. They reproduce through parthenogenesis. They only have daughters. Now, it's a hybrid, and it's a hybrid between the other 2 species shown here, the one on the left and the one on the right. When those other 2 species crossbreed, they produce the neomexicanus, the New Mexico whip-tailed lizards. They only produce daughters, and those daughters are capable of parthenogenesis. So what we end up with is a series of different lineages of the New Mexico whip-tailed lizards that are all genetically different from each other. Now, in this species, Neomexicanus, the New Mexico whip-tailed lizards, does display courtship behavior that is seen in sexually reproducing lizards. When a female lays eggs, right after that, she will start acting like a male, and she will display and court and simulate mating with another female. A female that has been, air quotes, mated will lay a larger clutch of eggs than if she wasn't stimulated by this process. So with parthenogenesis, the main disadvantage is a low genetic diversity for the species. All of the unfertilized eggs are going to be very genetically similar to the parent. This makes the entire population vulnerable to diseases, vulnerable to changes in the environment. A higher genetic diversity means that some individuals are likely to have the genes needed to survive changes in the environment or new diseases that come along. In many marine fishes and many plants where you have true hermaphrodites, these individuals are capable of fertilizing themselves. This is called self-fertilization. When you have a species that can do self-fertilization, during meiosis, there's quite a lot of genetic rearranging going on, which means the offspring are not genetically identical to the parent, and you have more genetic diversity. Now, these plants and marine fish that can self-fertilize do not always self-fertilize, so you keep up that genetic diversity. Now, here's the question. If there are all of these methods of reproducing without sex, why do we have sex? Yes, okay, snicker, snicker, it's because it's fun. That's not why sex evolved. There are negative consequences to sexual reproduction. Things like it takes two. If you put a female human on an island by herself, she can't reproduce. The fertility per individual is lower when you need two. And no matter how successful you are, you're only passing on half of your genes. Compared to asexuality, where if you're highly successful, your offspring would be able to outcompete sexually produced individuals because they've got, if you're very, very successful, they've got more genes that would potentially make them very, very successful. Sexual reproduction is energetically expensive. Think of all the energy that goes into courtship and mating behavior that could otherwise be used to just produce offspring. So there's got to be an advantage. And there is. This is called the Red Queen hypothesis. There's a book by Lewis Carroll, best known for Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. In his book, the Red Queen states that it takes all the running you can do just to stay in one place. I know how she feels. But in evolutionary terms, this means when it comes to dealing with diseases, you need to keep changing the genes within a species to keep up with the changes in the disease. It's an arms race. Diseases like bacteria and parasites that are not successful will constantly change their attack mechanisms to increase their ability to infect individuals. And so the host species has to change their defenses to reduce the risk of that disease or reduce their parasite load. We've already seen this in the COVID pandemic, where a new strain of the virus showed up that was more infectious and more deadly, that the Delta strain. So what kind of evidence do we have for the Red Queen hypothesis? So biologists can use organisms, such as this snail over here, that can do either sexual or asexual reproduction to see if this idea about an arms race is true. In situations where there are diseases or parasites, but at very, very low levels or completely absent, the asexually reproducing individuals outbreed the sexually reproducing individuals. So they end up producing more offspring if they're asexual than if they're sexual. However, you introduce diseases or parasites and the opposite is true. The sexually reproducing individuals outcompete the asexually reproducing individuals. Asexually reproducing individuals, when there's a parasite involved, have a higher parasite load, which means they have less energy to reproduce. Their energy has to go into fighting off the parasites. Pretty cool experiment showing support for this Red Queen hypothesis. This idea of why we have sex. Okay. Now, we've been talking about sex determination, types of reproduction that you may not be familiar with. And I want to introduce you to the fact that some types of organisms have more than 2 sexes. Fungi, for example, have an insane number of sexes. But it's not just in fungi. Having more than 2 sexes is going to increase the genetic diversity of the species. And a lot of times, like with the fungi, an individual fungus can mate with another organism that is any of the different sexes. So there can be 30 different sexes in a species, and as long as you run into one of the 29 types that's not you, you're good to go. Why am I looking at a bird? You're looking at a bird because the white-throated sparrow is a vertebrate example. This species has 4 sexes. It has males, pictured on the left, that have a white stripe on their head. So their heads are white and black stripes. They have males that have tan and brown stripes. There are females with black and white stripes. And on the right is a female with tan and brown stripes on the head. Birds, both male and female, that are white and black striped are more promiscuous. They put less effort into raising the offspring. They're more aggressive, and they're very good singers, primarily the males. Whereas the individuals with brown striped heads are more likely to be faithful to their partners. They are homebodies who protect their offspring from predators like snakes and raccoons, risking their own lives to protect their offspring. And they're poor singers. there's a process called dissociative mating that keeps these four sexes in one species. Individuals mate with others that are different than themselves. So if you have black and white stripes on your head, you are going to prefer to mate with individuals who have tan and brown stripes on their head. If you have tan and brown stripes, you want to mate with the black and white stripes. So this keeps each couple capable of raising offspring pretty well, and it keeps all four sexes in the same species. Wow, this was a wild ride. I hope you enjoyed it.